Every successful person got there by going through tough times. Success is a hard-ass teacher who likes to knock you around along that journey. You know, it takes real guts to not give up and keep going. We'll hear stories about failures and how these leaders flip the script to create success. I'm John Schultz. Join me and let's discover how success is never really overnight. So welcome to the John Schultz podcast. We have a fellow real estate entrepreneur today on my podcast, which I'm very happy about since that's what I do for a living. His name is Willy Walker. He's chairman, CEO of Walker & Dunlop, a preeminent commercial real estate finance firm. Willy's been named Financier of the Year in 2017, 2020 from Commercial Mortgage Observer. He sits on the board of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Foundation, an MBA from Harvard, an avid runner and cyclist, and a fellow webcaster, podcaster himself. Pretty much a Renaissance man by that description. And I'm so happy you're on the podcast, Willy. Thank you so much for doing it.
Great to be here, Jonathan.
Nice. So, all right, here we go. So, this is the myth to overnight success. Obviously, we all have our journeys and we start out, when we're young and have aspirations. So how would you describe yourself growing up as a kid? What motivated you and made you young Willy?
I would say growing up in Washington, D.C., my father ran Walker & Dunlop. It was a company that my grandfather started. So Walker & Dunlop was sort of in my blood from day one. And it was a small family-owned company based in DC, one office throughout its entire history before I joined it. And it was a neat regional mortgage banking firm. And I got to know my grandfather very well. He'd gone to Annapolis and started the company back in 1937. And my dad worked there his entire career. My mom was White House photographer for Time magazine. And so my parents lived sort of an interesting, there's sort of two worlds in DC, Jonathan. There's the kind of the actual economy, and then there's the people who work in politics and who are on Capitol Hill. And so my mom had access, if you will, to Capitol Hill and what went on at the White House. And my dad was part of the sort of the DC economy. And there are very few families, if you will, that kind of split those two sides, if you will. And so it was neat because you kind of had the sense that we belonged in a community. And I went to school with kids whose parents were lawyers and lobbyists and bankers and all sorts of stuff on the DC side. And then my mom, through her work, had access to all the people who were sort of the transient part of DC, of an administration that would come in, or senators or congressmen and women. And so, at St. Albans, where I went to school, sort of in DC, the heroes, if you will, the people you kind of looked up to were the congressmen, congresswomen, and senators who had kids who were at St. Albans with me. And so I grew up sort of always looking at people like Tim Worth from Colorado or Jack Hines from Pennsylvania as sort of the people to emulate, if you will. That was, that, if you will, to use LA. If you grow up in LA, the people who are in the movie industry are typically the people that the kids look up to. And if you grow up in New York, the people in the finance industry are typically the people you look up to. And someone who has a dad who's a fancy investment banker might be the person that everyone says, oh, that person's got a really cool dad. So that was kind of the backdrop. And I would just say that, I always thought I'd do something in politics just because I grew up around it. Yep. I was, president of my classes and captain of my sports teams, and have always sort of felt pulled to leadership positions. I've, to a great degree, I've obviously worked for other people, and I obviously work for the board of directors of Walker & Dunlop today, even though I am chairman. But I've always sort of worked either for myself or been very entrepreneurial in the way that I've approached my career. And I've always liked leading people and leading groups more than doing a specific thing. So I think that one of the themes that comes up throughout my career is that, for instance, Walker & Dunlop, I don't particularly love commercial real estate. I don't particularly love the brokerage or banking world. I love building a business and working with people and leading those people to achieve success. And it's dramatically different than my dad. You drive down the street with my dad, he loves the built environment. My dad driving down the street, he'll look at every building that's being built. He'll want to know who's building it. He'll want to know the architect on it. He'll want to know who's leasing it. And I go down the street with my handheld in place, texting with my team, trying to kind of, lead and drive the company forward. I mean, that's the difference really down to its core of my dad and what he did with his business of doing something he loved because he loved the built world and loved being in the mortgage industry. To me, where I've gone to a bunch of different industries, loved everything I've done, but it didn't really make that much difference whether I was working for Morgan Stanley, TPG, Teletech, or Walker and Dunlop.
Interesting. So, I mean, I grew up in a real estate family as well. And then when I got out of college, I went work for a brokerage company, not my father's company at that point in time. And I get what you mean. Like, what fascinated me about real estate was like how you how'd the toothpaste get to the shelf, or how things were actually made. And I felt real estate had all these other industries in the building that you can learn from and learn like how the world sort of worked and what goes on in the world, because they were all your tenants or people that you represented to, help them grow in the direction that they did. And that's what actually kept me going in the industry and loving it so much. I always felt like every day I was working with a different company, which made me learn about something new and kept my curiosity and creativity happy along the way. And, you are a leader. You're now at a public company, which we'll talk about, but you sort of veered and forged your own path when you were ready to go to work. And it was, out of the country, and it was, startups, I guess, in Latin America. Maybe you could give everyone a little insight on what made you sort of veer in that direction, knowing that yet, you were in a real estate sort of environment and made you not choose that.
So I honestly had zero interest in ever going to work for Walker and Dunlop. Zero. Like negative interest. I didn't want to be associated with the family company. I didn't. And my dad, because he went straight from undergrad to working for Walker and Dunlop, had established a rule that my brother nor I could ever work for Walker and Dunlop for at least 5 years out of undergrad. But I mean, I wasn't even thinking that I'd ever do it in 50 years. I had no interest. So when I wanted to be an investment banker, that was my dream job. And so coming out of undergrad, I was headed down to New York. Well, I was at home over Thanksgiving vacation my senior year in college, and the U.S. ambassador to Paraguay was a President Reagan appointee to be ambassador to Paraguay, career foreign service officer. And Ambassador Towell said to me, "What are you doing next year?" And I said, "I want to go to Wall Street." And he said, "Well, why don't you come to Paraguay?" And I said, and I honestly, Jonathan, I was like, Paraguay, Latin America, Africa, like, where's Paraguay? And I had an offer to go to work for Merrill Lynch, and I was going down to New York for a sell day where they were bringing in all the analysts to kind of get, be sold on why we ought to go work for Merrill Lynch. And I called my parents to tell them that I was going down to NYC to go visit for the sell day, and they said, "Don't go." And I was like, "What do you mean don't go?" They're like, "You ought to take Ambassador Towell up on his offer to go to Paraguay. You can always go to Wall Street. You can't always go to Paraguay at the invitation of the U.S. ambassador." And they were incredibly insightful in saying that. Most parents, I think, would sort of say, "Hey, great job on Wall Street, go get it. You start making money." There was no certainty that I'd go to Paraguay and find a job, enjoy it, whatever else. But they were right that was going to be a unique experience. And so I went to Paraguay in 1989 with my bags packed for 6 months, and I ended up staying for 3 years. And that experience taught me a lot. It taught me a new language. I'd taken Spanish 3 and got a C on my Spanish 3 final and said, "I'll never speak that godforsaken language again." And little did I know I'd be fluent a couple of years later. It taught me to live far, far away from home and be accustomed to, being in a very foreign place with no friend base and having to meet people and learn their language and to accommodate to what their culture was like and what they thought and taught. And I will say, as a white male in the United States of America, who came from a family that had a family business and in DC, where there were lots and lots of connections and people that we knew, to go sort of to the end of the earth and have my name and who I was and what I looked like have zero impact was an incredible experience at a young age. It made me really, really understand what it's like to be a foreigner, what it's like to not speak someone's language, to sit around a room and have no connectivity whatsoever to anyone in the room. They're sitting around talking about, oh, that person went to school with me and that person's my cousin and that person goes to church with me. And I had none of that connectivity. And so I do think that that gave me insight to what it's like to be a minority, what it's like to be the outsider, what it's like to be a woman sitting in a room with, 8 men and be the single woman. And so I do think that that experience of living down there, and by the way, I spent a decade in Latin America, so it wasn't just Paraguay. I went from Paraguay, came back to the States for business school, worked in Morgan Stanley's Latin American corporate finance group during summers at business school, had offers to go to work for a bunch of investment banks and consulting firms out of business school, and decided to go back down to Latin America. And I went to Chile, and again, all new friendships, I remember distinctly arriving in Chile my first day after business school and just sitting there and going like, you're doing this again, dude. You're going to the end of the world and you don't know anyone here, and you got to create all new relationships. But Latin America had given me the opportunity to do things that I knew I couldn't have done in the United States. And I knew that it would give me additional opportunities if I went back down there after business school, rather than going to Morgan Stanley and being an associate. And sure enough, I ended up starting an airline in Argentina, which was an incredibly hard and engaging experience, and everything to do with leasing airplanes from the United States and getting pilots trained at LaGuardia Airport at flight safety and all the different things that went into building an airline. And then went from there to work for Texas Pacific Group in their Latin American buyout fund called Newbridge Latin America. We tried to buy Aerolíneas Argentinas from the government of Argentina, did a bunch of other deals down there. And I would say one of the things that I learned very much, Jonathan, is that, macro risk is, if you will, binary, to the degree that in the United States, stabilized economy, UK, stabilized economy, you're not going to get big macro swings, even though obviously we've seen the markets move a lot in the past couple of months. But the point is that you're not going to have wipeout scenarios, generally speaking, in established economies. But in Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil and Chile, when you get big macro shifts, you can wipe out everything. And so we've done a bunch of great investments, and I mean really good investments in Argentina. And in 2000, in came President Kirchner, who devalued the currency, and everything that we'd done just got wiped. I mean, just wiped. No matter how good the deal was, no matter how good the underlying company was, it just got wiped out. And so that taught me a lot as it relates to macro risk and what it is to deal with macro risk. And one of the things that we've done at W&D, after I spent a decade living in Latin America, and then I went to Europe and worked in Europe for 3 years. What we did at W&D when I came to W&D was I said, look, the US commercial real estate industry is so big and we are such a small firm. Let's focus on being the best in the United States and not focus on Europe and Latin America, where, by the way, that was where my friend base was. That's where all my relationships were. I could have started Walker and Dunlop in Mexico City, snapping my fingers, or in London, where I just lived. But that macro risk piece, and also just focusing on where there was opportunity for growth and really focusing on it, because I'd also seen how hard it is to start up foreign operations and to scale foreign operations to make significant dollars, if you will, bringing it back to our currency, in a foreign operation. So a lot of lessons learned during that period of time.
What the lesson I'm learning from you, which I'm enjoying listening to, is you are the ultimate example of putting yourself outside your comfort zone, right? I mean, you listen to what your parents said, but go to Paraguay and check it out, right? Which you were open to, and you actually did it. A lot of people wouldn't have made that move. And you've just lived in your uncomfort zone for years, which made you have to be a much more open person, which is incredible to what's around you and to learn about what's around you. And, then you started your business career and you kept going from there. What I heard, I guess your mentor was Jack Hennessy from Credit Suisse. And what I loved, what I heard you say, or him say to you, is accumulate as many scars as quickly as possible. To me, the only way I've ever learned in my career was from my scars, and scars being, I guess you call them failures, right? I mean, I wish failure had a different definition to it. To me, it's learning something. what do you feel, your biggest scars were? What role pushed your limits to get through it, other than just always not being afraid to change?
So you going back to Jack, I mean, the anecdote behind that and Jack's comment to me, I'd just gotten out of Harvard Business School. I'd spent 2 years where you wanted to have exactly the right answer to every single case. And the one thing you never, ever wanted to do was say something stupid inside of your classroom, because everyone, all 90 other students would look at you and be like, Willy's an idiot. And so you spent 2 years trying to be the smartest and try and never say something stupid or fail in any way. And all of a sudden I had this business plan for this startup airline, and I was telling Hennessy about it. And at that time he was CEO of Credit Suisse. And he said, go accumulate as many scars as quickly as possible. In other words, go fail. And my head like spun around. I was like, here's my, mentor, someone who I think walks on water, running one of the largest investment banks in the world. And he's basically telling me to go fail. And it took me a while to understand what he was saying. But he wasn't saying, have the airline go under, which by the way, it did in 2000 with the devaluation. I was long beyond it at that point. But when you have all of your leases and all of your fuel contracts in dollars and the government devalues the peso, you're in real trouble. But to your specific issue, Jonathan, as it relates to, what'd you learn? When I got the airline launched, my boss, who ran the venture capital firm that was backing us, really kind of wanted to play general manager. And I was general manager. And I kept saying to him, Jose Luis, if you want to run this airline, come over to Argentina and you can run it. But if you want me to run it, I've got to have the ability to decide whether we're flying to Salta and Tucumán once or twice a day, not you. And he kept kind of micromanaging. And I finally said, I'm done. And I thought that I was like the glue that held the whole team together. I'd put together the management team. I'd hired everyone. I'd put blood, sweat, and tears into starting the airline. And the day that my replacement showed up in the conference room, I thought everyone would still be looking to me for marching orders. And I watched everyone's focus move from me straight to the guy at the end of the table who was my replacement. And the only thing they wanted to listen to was what he said, because he was the boss. And I learned a really early lesson about leadership and about corporations and about the fact that when you sit in the seat, the only thing that gives you the authority is you sitting in that seat. And you can be a great leader, you can be a crappy leader, but you're in the seat, and it's an honor and a privilege to be in the seat. But the day you move out of that seat, someone else will sit there and someone else will run what you're doing. Don't get too caught up in your like unique ability to be the person at the head of the table, if you will, or the person who's, leading the team and leading the charge. And that was a very hard thing for me to handle after investing so much time and effort and been so emotionally committed to it. Other things, getting bribed. I'd never been bribed before. We checked all the boxes. We did everything perfectly. And on the day our planes arrived from the United States, the head of customs in our province in northern Argentina shows up and basically says, if you want your planes to get out of the hangar tomorrow morning, you're going to come to my office and you're going to pay me something. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And, all the back and forth with our lawyers and with our lobbyists and everyone about, what do we do and how do we get out of this? And we've done everything right. And they're like, yeah, but there's certain things to doing business in Argentina. So there were a lot of life lessons that were learned by being thrust into a general management role at a young age. And those kinds of life lessons, I think, have helped me tremendously scale Walker & Dunlop and then deal with all of the things that happen when you run a pretty scaled, publicly traded company that, has its ups, has its downs. We've been very, very fortunate as a public company to have an incredible run as it relates to our stock chart over a 12-year public period. And, if you'd invested in 2016 in the FANG stocks and Walker & Dunlop and held them for 5 years from 2016 to 2021, which was an incredible period for the FANG stocks, the only one that you would have done better in other than Walker & Dunlop is Apple. So we beat Amazon over that period of time. We beat Netflix over that period of time. We beat Google over that period of time. So we've had a very, if you will, privileged run as a public company. And a lot of it comes from both the team as well as understanding that no business is made overnight and no business is lost overnight. Just sticking at it and staying true to who we are.
And you would, a mortgage company, right? A finance company, you wouldn't think that would be the ultimate story. So it's kudos to you. When was the moment though you said, okay, You didn't want to ever go into this business. I mean, you emphatically said that at the beginning of the interview.
Yep.
What changed your mind? Like where did that come from? Because, you know, to be that emphatic, to actually have an open mind is a big change.
So I was, there were two things that happened. First of all, I'd spent, as I've just described to you, I spent the better part of the first decade of my career, and it was actually 10 years in Latin America and 3 years in Europe. So the first 13 years of my professional career, other than going back to business school, I spent abroad, Latin America and in Europe. And I'd never had any sense of being home, being in DC, whatever. And then my wife, Sheila, and I had our first child, Jack, in London. And this sort of homing device went off inside of me saying, get close to family. And we had a decision to make. Would we stay in Europe? And I always felt that to make a difference at whatever firm you're at, you've got to spend at least 5 to 7 years to both have a real impact and then also create significant wealth. And so I was like, do we want to spend another 5 to 7 years in Europe after having spent 3, or do we want to go back to the States? And so we then just said, let's get back to the States. And then the other piece to it was I was on the board of Walker and Dunlop, and I held an offsite with my dad's management team. It was a teeny company at the time. And I led the senior management team through kind of a strategy session of what you could do and how you could build the firm. And as I was getting in the car to go back to Dulles Airport, I turned to my dad and I said, I could help you with this company. And my dad said, I have always known you could. I just didn't think you had any interest. And I think, Jonathan, the thing was, it was kind of a confluence of personal events, wanting to move back to the States. And I would also say the final thing to it was, if you added up all my stock options at the publicly traded company that I was working for at that time as a senior executive, I think I had 60 basis points of stock in the company. Like everything vests over the next 10 years and you're going to get to 60 basis points of some publicly traded company. And my dad owned Walker and Dunlop, and he'd been nice enough to give my brother and me 2% of one of the investments that he'd made. And so I actually owned something of something. And I sort of sat there and I said, why am I working for 60 basis points of some publicly traded company, whereas I can put my efforts towards a company that my family owns and hopefully create real wealth? And obviously, in hindsight, given that Walker and Dunlop, when I joined it, was worth about $25 million and our market cap hit 5 billion at the end of 2021, we were able to create a lot of value.
It's amazing. It's amazing. So, okay. So here you are, I guess you joined in 2003, you worked, you became president, I guess a couple years later, you tripled the revenue. What are some of the, it sounds so good, but what were some of the things the headwinds that it took to actually get a real estate firm to actually look enticing enough to go public and to actually grow in the way that you did? Because it's a churn, right? Mortgages are a churn. What was the biggest sort of moment that changed the company? What was it? A deal? Was it something else? Where do you think that landed?
There are a bunch of different things that I think are important to its growth and development. The first is, it was a great firm that my dad had built, and it had a really good culture to it when I joined it. The second is that Howard Smith, who is still the president at Walker and Dunlop, became my partner in building the company. He knew and still does know more about the mortgage industry than I will ever know. And so I could be sort of Mr. Out and he could be Mr. In. And that allowed me to bring my banking background and my general leadership skills to the platform, while Howard could run the origination and the underwriting of mortgages. And as much as I got up to speed on all of that, it was fundamental to me to have a partner like Howard in the firm. The third thing is, we had no capital, we had no brand. And so you had to gain momentum, sort of taking baby steps of, I couldn't just go out and do something big. I couldn't go buy some company. I couldn't recruit bankers or brokers from CBRE. I mean, we didn't have anything that someone would come and join. And so it was, a lot of, if you will, singles, not even doubles, like hitting singles on a consistent basis, growing origination volumes, growing revenues. And then I think the other thing that was fundamental to it, Jonathan, was the culture. There were, I looked at the brokerage business and I looked at the lending business. And what I realized was, for a small firm with no brand and no capital, it was by the grace of God that our brokers would show back up the next day, because they had their individual business. It was XYZ broker working with you, for instance, to find capital for a deal that you and your team are looking for capital for. it's really an individual business. The brand of Walker and Dunlop wasn't adding a lot to that business line. And there was no capital going into it. So it was literally by the grace of God, they'd come back the next day rather than walking across the street to CBRE or JLL. So I really didn't like that business. But I saw on the lending side that we actually were putting capital into deals, that the brand actually made a difference. And we were actually underwriting the deals that made it so that a banker at Walker and Dunlop really saw value in the brand and all the support services around him or her. And so I saw that very early on and said, that's the business we need to build. And so from when I joined the company until we went public, and even a couple of years after we went public, we went all in on the lending business because it had stickiness to it. And it also had long-term revenue streams behind the servicing that would come off.
Yeah, you have recurring revenue, right? It wasn't like a start over every day.
You got it. So when I joined Walker and Dunlop, our servicing portfolio was about $2.8 billion of loans. Today, it's $120 billion. So that growth from 2.8 billion to 120 billion just kicks off a huge amount of cash every single year. And that's the engine behind the publicly traded company. But I think the other piece to it was that we also, as I underinvested in brokerage, we also had one big broker who really wasn't a good guy. And he was all out for himself. And I realized in 2006 to 7 that I had to get rid of him, but I couldn't. He was too big. He was too much of our revenues. He had too much of a sway in everything that went on in the company. And so I realized at that time that I had to scale the company away from him, that if we stayed as a small company, he would always have undue influence and sway over what we were doing. And so from 2006, 2007 to 2011, we just scaled the business as fast as we could. And the great financial crisis helped. Actually, it helped us because we had countercyclical capital from Fannie Mae, and then we acquired a company that got us into Freddie Mac and HUD. So in 2008 and 2009, really 2009, because we made the acquisition in 9 and 10, we had countercyclical capital. And that helped us grow to go public in 2010. And then the moment that I was big enough to be able to walk into that guy's office and say, okay, it's my way or the highway, he took the highway, and he thankfully is no longer with Walker and Dunlop. But I think that had a lot to do with the culture as well, Jonathan, that I understood that as long as this gentleman was there and acting in this way, we'd never get a cohesive group of people because he was undermining the culture of the firm. And so it's not just raising capital. It's not just creating a brand. It's maintaining a culture of teamwork and camaraderie that's so fundamental to being able to scale a business the way we scaled W&D.
It's so interesting, right? Because we look at all these companies that are large and have done amazing things. And when you're being, forthright, and your motive was to get rid of this one guy. I mean, and it pushed you in a direction you may not have gone unless that one person was there creating that sort of havoc for you. And then I know you bought the Column Financial acquisition during, an interesting time in the market, and you kept on your plan, and then here you are today. It's terrific. It's incredible. So, that's the business side of you. What I also find so interesting about you is, the fitness side of you, and the same sort of intent that you have to be the best at something. You're an avid cyclist, an avid, runner. I heard that, the first time you did it, it was I think in 2 hours and 45 seconds. Yeah, some crazy.
2 hours, 45 minutes.
Yeah, some crazy. So what, was that always part of you your whole life? Is it something that, because, when we're so hard charging, I know I need something to counterbalance me. And I love working out. I love golf, right? I like having stuff outside of my work life, even though I think it's all meshed together anyway. But what got you going in that direction and being so sort of into fitness?
So I was a high school cross-country runner, hockey player, and lacrosse player. I played lacrosse in college. I got out of college. I moved to Latin America, and I started to put on weight. And I'll never forget that somebody one day called me gordito, which is little fat guy.
Oh, God, that's
in Latin America, unlike in the States, people will tell you to your face Jonathan, you look like shit, or, you put on some weight or whatever. They're just very much more kind of in your face about what's going on with your life. In the United States, it's more like, oh, I'd never pass judgment on you or whatever else. And
Right.
I wouldn't sit there and say like,
They won't go there,
you're
especially
looking a little
now.
heavy today. But in Latin America, they do. And it's actually in a loving way. But at that time, to me, it was like, oh my God, like I'm heavy. I'm like putting on weight. And, for me, I had one too many empanadas, if you will, and wasn't doing that much exercise. And so I kind of got on the running thing. And by the way, my life in Paraguay was very solo. Like I would spend weekends reading books. Like, I mean, in the States, if I'd been in New York or Boston after college, I'd be out every Friday night and Saturday night with friends and going to football games and have a great time. The concept that I wake up on a Saturday morning, go for a 6-mile run, and then read a book all day long and go to sleep and wake up on Sunday and do the same thing over was just a totally out of body experience for me, but incredibly good for me. And that, being in Paraguay and starting to really run on a very consistent basis, got me going. Then I ran marathons and did, as you said, rightfully, my first Boston Marathon was a 2:45, and then I ran a 2:36. And I was like, wow, I'm pretty fast. And then
pretty fast. I mean, come on.
It was pretty good. And then I got into triathlons. The DC mayor, Adrian Fenty, back in the 2008, 2009 era, got me, we ran together, and then he said, let's do triathlon. So we got bikes and we got in the pool and we started to train for triathlons. And I got pretty cranked up on triathlons and competed at the national level and had a great time doing triathlons, and realized that competitively doing triathlons with 3 kids under 10 and a publicly traded company probably wasn't the greatest use of time, or, I was stretching.
Yeah, I have friends that have lost themselves in triathlons. Like the training and like because you start getting addicted to discipline, which is like, it's good, but it could also drive you into insanity.
You got it. And so the bottom line is, I've always been very focused on athletics, and I'm fortunate to have been, quite a good college athlete. And so I've got athletics in me. And I guess the final piece to the chapter, Jonathan, is just the person who introduced the two of us, Strauss Zelnick, is a dear friend of mine. And Strauss really got me into weightlifting. And I'd been Mr. Cardio, and Strauss kept saying, cardio is great, but when you get to be 70 years old, you're not going to be wanting to run a 6-minute mile. You're going to be wanting to get out of the chair. You're going to be able to want to pick up the groceries. You're going to want to be able to live an active, long life, and strength and agility and stretching is so much more important than cardio. And so over the past couple of years, I've done more and more in the gym, and kind of have do cardio and do the gym, and hopefully sometimes do both. And that's really had a huge impact on my overall physical fitness, which has been great. And I owe that all to Strauss as it relates to getting into the gym.
Yeah, listen, I didn't know there was another Strauss in the world till I met you. I mean, you guys are almost like brothers from another mother. It's almost crazy. Great guy too, and very, very, very fitness oriented, and another great CEO. So you guys have a lot of the same qualities. So, all right. So you're this avid reader, right? I mean, we learned you read lots of books. What's a current book you're reading right now, and what would you recommend to the audience to read?
Oh, wow. So a couple things. I'll give you the last 3 really quickly. The first is one that's called CEO Excellence. I've got it right here next to me. It's by a team of McKinsey consultants. The lead on it is Carolyn Dewar. And I had Carolyn on my webcast. You want to talk about what makes great companies, and CEO Excellence, an incredible, incredible read. The next one is Mike Allen's book, Smart Brevity. I had Mike on the webcast last week, and it's all about being concise in your communications. And we at Walker and Dunlop, literally in the last 2 weeks, have started focusing on smart brevity, and it has been amazing. Just taking everything that you write, an email, a client email, or communication, and just breaking it down and getting right to the point and trying to remember specifically that one issue you want them to remember. And so I did my second smart brevity email to all Walker and Dunlop employees today. I got 5 emails from W&Ders today saying, love the new format, love the brevity, love getting right to it. And then the final one is actually in preparation for my webcast tomorrow, which is with Molly Bloom. And that's called Molly's Game. And it's all about Molly running the most exclusive private poker game in the United States until she got busted by the feds for having.
It's a great movie, man. I love that movie.
It's a great movie.
Such a good
fantastic movie. And
yeah.
I can't wait to, Molly's become a friend of mine over the past month or so here in Denver. And I can't wait to have Molly on tomorrow. But Molly's Game is really interesting about how she differentiated herself and how she was entrepreneurial in creating that game.
And integrity to the end. She just kept her
integrity,
word.
integrity. But the interesting thing about that, Jonathan, is it's integrity at the same time as breaking the law. And so
the
interesting thing about it is you sit there and you have such respect for Molly because she didn't rat out all the people that did all sorts of things to her. And so, yes, incredible integrity. And at the same time, behind it all, for instance, her podcast this week is all about gambling, sports gambling.
Right.
And one of the things that the feds threw against her was she was a big sports gambler herself. Well, that was all illegal back then. You had to use a bookie other than being in Vegas. And one of the things she says is, I got busted in 2013 by the feds for something that today is 100% legal. And it's just interesting how the world has changed. So
and same thing with marijuana, cannabis. I mean, like there's so much change in the last 10 years. It's crazy. All right. And then, all right, we're going to leave on this. First of all, your webcast, I watch it. You're awesome. You have amazing people on. What made you do that? I mean, you could probably ask me the same question, but like, what made you want to even do a webcast podcast in the first place?
The pandemic, 100%. It was not like sitting around in a room with a bunch of people saying, oh, this would be really fun, or clearly not, you'd be good at it or anything else. It was getting information out to our clients at the beginning of the pandemic. And so the pandemic hit on that Friday. I turned to my head of marketing over the weekend, said we really ought to do something with our clients, tell them what's going on in the markets. And there were just two quick things, Jonathan, on it that made it what it is today. The first was that I decided rather than having Walker and Dunlop employees or me speak, I would bring in outside guests. And so we not only brought in outside guests where we weren't talking our own book, but getting outside perspectives, but then I broadened it from commercial real estate. It was the first topic for the first week and the second week with Barry Sternlicht. But after that, we went everywhere, and we went to university presidents and professional athletes and actors and actresses and economists and all sorts of people. So I got a broad group of people to do it. And then the second thing is that we, while everybody else kind of phased out after the pandemic and trying to do webcasts and all that stuff, we've stayed with it. And so every Wednesday at 12:30, we're there, and it has got a very, very large following that has been not only fun personally and enriching, but it's been incredible from a Walker and Dunlop standpoint as it relates to just getting the brand out there and having people want to, glean the information from the webcast that they do.
Well, I will suggest everyone listening to this to listen to the Walker webcast. It's what you said, Wednesday at 12 o'clock, plus it's on YouTube and all other places that you can find it. I listen to it every week now, and I love it. You get great guests, and it, like you said, you went outside your industry and you're getting all these different perspectives from different people. And I learned something from it every week. And I know that everyone's going to learn something from you on this podcast. You're terrific. I want to thank you so much for doing this. I know how valuable your time is. And I just want to say how much I appreciate it.
Well, Jonathan, it's been a real pleasure. And thank you very much for both doing your homework on my career and having me on and talking about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.